All right, hello everyone. So I know we're not meeting for class this week, and I didn't have a lecture video pre-prepared for this, so I do apologize for the delay in getting this posted, but obviously it takes time to record these videos and process them and everything. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to briefly talk about and highlight some of the points related to deep ecology and wilderness preservation from this week's reading. Okay, let me go ahead and share the screen here. Okay, and this lecture sheet basically is already available in the course module on Blackboard. All right, so I'm just going to be using this instead of my fancy Prezi presentations. This will just be much easier. Okay, so before we get into criticisms of wilderness preservation and how it's related to Western imperialism, I do need to spend some time talking about the nature of deep ecology. Okay, now, as is indicated by the reading, deep ecology is contrasted with what is known as shallow ecology, but it's not abundantly clear whether or not this distinction between deep ecology and shallow ecology really picks out an important difference between the two. So, as far as deep ecologists are concerned, shallow ecology is largely driven by concerns for conserving natural resources in such a way that they'll be useful to future generations and to other human beings. So the criticism goes that shallow ecology is largely anthropocentric, whereas deep ecology is entirely biocentric. Okay, so this first aspect of deep ecology, this move from an anthropocentric way of thinking about this kind of thing to a biocentric way of thinking about this, is obviously that the realm of nature and the things in it have intrinsic value in their own right, and things in nature, not only in terms of individual organisms, but entire ecosystems and natural habitats have intrinsic value in their own right, independently of any sort of human concerns, interests. Okay, now, and then furthermore, in virtue of this move from a supposed like deeply rooted anthropocentric way of thinking about things to a more biocentric way of thinking about things, there's also a movement away from environmental and ecological policies, which are primarily focused on mitigation and prevention. Okay, so here, if we're talking about pollution cleanup and no longer polluting, implementing certain kinds of green policies and things like this, um, the deep ecologist is going to say that, okay, to the extent that these things are important, it's largely like putting a band-aid on a bigger problem. So similar to Paul Taylor's convictions about the ethics of respect for nature needing to involve a change of worldview, a way of thinking about nature rather than just a change in practice. The deep ecologist likewise has this sort of concern where they're going to say, no, the way we think about ourselves in relation to the natural world needs to change. You can't have just the change in practice without the change in ethos, if you will. So if certain practices are problematic because they are sort of deeply rooted in problematic anthropocentric and human-centered ways of thinking about ourselves and how we relate to nature, then unless you get to the root of the problem, which is that, that ethos that we have about how we relate to nature, inevitably the same kinds of problems with practice, problems with overconsumption, problems with pollution, and those kinds of things are going to continue. Okay, so we should be focused on cleanup efforts and new socioeconomic policies that are environmentally conscious, yes, but changing our way of thinking and our very way of living, what we think we need versus what we actually need with respect to consumption of resources, that's what needs to change radically. And again, by radical change here, we mean change that gets to the very root of the problem. Okay, now, thirdly, and this is where things get for lack of a better term, kind of philosophically spooky here. Um, Deep ecologists largely reject what's typified as dualistic norms or dualistic ways of thinking. Okay, so what a dualism establishes is at least a bivalent categorization of things. So if you're a dualist with respect to reality or with respect to anything, you're going to say that there need to be at least two useful categories or useful conceptions of things in order to fully articulate what is sort of going on here. So classic examples of dualistic ways of thinking would be this notion of human versus nature, or the social versus the natural, the rational versus the emotional, these kinds of things, the physical versus the spiritual, so on and so forth. Okay, now dualism itself is not necessarily problematic in its own right, because here's why. You can have distinct categories which nevertheless supplement each other, and even complement each other in many kinds of ways. But in the history of the Western tradition, at least, we haven't really understood um, dualisms in this kind of supplemental or complementary kind of way. Western dualisms are somewhat adversarial in their way of presentations of things. So a prime example of this is, when we're talking about what the human versus the natural, or the rational versus the emotional, or the social versus the natural. Okay, so if part of what makes humanity what it is that we have the rational capacities to not give into our base instincts. If our base instincts are the source of violence and competition and selfishness and those kinds of things, and egoistic ways of thinking, or egotistical ways of thinking, if that's our natural inclination, then to the extent that in our humanity we are capable of sort of willfully and freely acting in a way that goes against our base nature, well, that must mean that our humanity is something much more than our nature. So we're not just animals that are biologically conditioned to act in certain kinds of ways. We are also complex sort of social beings which stand in certain social relationships and social dynamics. So there must be distinction here between human nature and kind of the essence of humanity. Now, but if there's a distinction to be made here, where to be human is to be more than just a human kind of animal, or to have a natural base or biologic inclination, what this establishes is a sort of adversarial relationship, or a competition between the two. So it's not my base biological nature and inclinations working in tandem with my social conditioning. We need the social conditioning to counteract the base biological nature. We've talked about this before when we talked about feminist ethics, right? When we talk about reason and emotion, these aren't two sort of distinct ways of thinking that can supplement each other and can work together. It's no, we need to silence our emotions in favor of our reason, or we need to pay attention to our emotions. We need, the heart versus the head, that kind of thing. So even though dualisms may not intentionally be set up in such a way where they are kind of at war with each other, or mutually exclusive with each other, or adversarial, anytime you set up a dualistic way of thinking of, okay, it's either A or B, that at least gives the sort of presentation that A and B are in some ways verbally, conceptually, and even metaphysically at odds with each other. Okay, so when we talk about humanity and nature, the deep ecologist is going to say, well, wait a minute, what this kind of dualism sets up is this notion, or at least enforces the notion, whether it's intentional or not, that we ourselves are somehow over and above nature, or we in our humanity are somehow either supernatural or extra natural or non-natural kinds of beings. And the deep ecologist is just going to say, well, that is a mistake. what dualism does is it treats us as completely bifurcated individuals, where I'm not something that has the capacity for reason and emotion. No, I'm a rational thing, and I'm also an emotional thing, and my reason and my emotion are in strife with each other or in conflict with each other. I'm not sort of the unification of a body and a soul. I'm a soul that occupies a body, and the body is the source of these kind of carnal desires, and my soul is the source of these kind of rational desires. So there's this battle between the soul and the body and humanity and nature and all this sort of stuff. And the deep ecologist is just going to say, okay, well, we need to move away from these more dualistic ways of thinking into a more holistic kind of view of the self. So in virtue of three, in virtue of this kind of rejection of a dualism or a strict dualism, there's a movement in deep ecology towards a more holistic understanding of the human self, which incorporates nature and our natural habitat and our natural environment as an essential component of who we are as human individuals. Okay, so again, this is where philosophically things get a little head scratchy and a little what we could call mostly ghostly. So according to the deep ecologist, we are not just naturally situated beings in some sort of flexible and contingent kind of way. Okay, our natural habitat, in terms of the way that we relate to nature, in particular the way that we relate to wilderness, this is actually an intrinsic component of who we are as human individuals. So we are not just environmentally situated, right? We're not just sort of accidentally environmentally situated. Being environmentally situated and standing in certain kinds of relationships to nature, this is part of the essence of humanity. This is part of the explanation of what it even means to be human in the first place. So the way I characterize it here, we're not just beings who happen to exist in the world. We are the world. Like, we're part of the world, and the world likewise is part of us. So how we relate to nature in our particular environmental circumstances, this plays a primary role in understanding who we are. Okay, so with this deep ecologist emphasis on getting back in touch with nature, it's actually a form of getting back in touch with oneself. And if you think about the ways we characterized, um, you know, uh, uh, communing with nature, or how we understand our relationship to nature previously, just in the history of environmental ethics and ecology, you know, there's a long history here of going out into wilderness or going out into the desert as a mode of self-discovery. The deep ecologist is going to say, yeah, because this kind of, if you will, socially constructed or largely artificial distinction between I and the world, right? I, the individual who is just situated in a world and finding, my goal is to sort of create my own meaning. No, the deep ecologist is going to say it more is of a matter of finding who we are in the world, because these two things cannot be neatly separated from each other. Okay, now, and as Ramachandra Guha points out, this is part of the problem with deep ecology, is that deep ecologists are drinking from a lot of philosophical wells, and the philosophical wells may themselves be blatantly inconsistent here. So when I say this sounds a little bit mostly ghostly, here's why. Because if you want to look at kind of the historical philosophical underpinnings of deep ecology, it's an entire like smorgasbord of various kinds of themes and moments, so they talk about Hegel, and they talk about Gautama the Buddha, and they talk about strands of Hinduism and Baha'i, and it's just a whole lot of stuff, both Western and Eastern, coming together in a really messy kind of way. And it's kind of flashy and pretty in that regard, but at the same time, it may not actually be a consistent presentation here. So, I mean, if
kind of the philosophical traditions by which deep ecologists are grounding themselves are in many ways inconsistent with each other and mutually kind of exclusive with each other. Yeah, that's something that deep ecologists themselves may not find problematic, but for the rest of us that are just trying to understand what the hell the deep ecologists are actually talking about, that might be problematic. So, you know, in another class, I referred to this as sort of Oprah religion. So, I mean, so, you know, if you think of religious traditions and philosophical traditions as kind of a buffet, you know, we're going to take our plate and we're going to take a little bit from Christianity and a little bit from Buddhism and a little bit from Islam and Judaism and Baha'i and Vedanta and Hinduism. And, you know, well, I like what this tradition has to say about this, and I really resonate with that, right? But what you end up with is just a conglomerate sort of mess here, okay? All right, so that leads us to 5. There's a higher emphasis on Eastern, but Eastern is largely understood as just kind of non-Western and even anti-Western. Okay, so it's not like deep ecologists are particularly conversant in Eastern philosophy and religion. There's a kind of attraction to the East. Why? Just because it's not West here. So you know, the idea is, okay, well, if the Western traditions are really the source of these kinds of philosophical problems here, these dualisms which set up kind of an adversarial picture of reality and conflicted picture of reality. Okay, well, if East is the other option available, well, to the extent that I am alienated from the West, I will turn to the East. So as Ramachandra Guha indicates, you know, a lot of these deep ecologists largely overemphasize what takes place in the East, not because they think that there's something of value per se to be had in the East, but there's kind of a fetishization here with Eastern philosophy, just because it's characterized as wholly other than what we are commonly used to in that respect. Okay, so there's a higher emphasis on Eastern, you know, Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, and Jain conceptions of nature, where these religious and philosophical traditions themselves are kind of seen as having a healthier or a higher emphasis on how I, as the individual, relate to nature than Western ways of thinking typically do. Okay, so, and the link here is, to the extent that deep ecologists are advocating a really holistic sort of biocentrism, the message is, okay, well, if you want to find biocentric perspectives, you got to look to Buddhism, you got to look to Hinduism, you got to look to Taoism, you got to look to Jainism. You know, if you want to have a biocentric outlook, you're not going to find it in the West. You got to go to the East. And Ramachandra Guha is someone who is conversant with Indian philosophy in particular and Eastern approaches to philosophy, you know, scratches his head and says, okay, well, how much do these deep ecologists actually know about Eastern religious and philosophical traditions? Because if you're looking for a full-fledged biocentrism, the kind that deep ecologists are talking about here, as far as Ramachandra Guha is concerned, you're not really going to find it, or at least you're not going to find the sort of biocentrism that the deep ecologists say you're going to find in the East. Okay, so it's kind of like hijacking a religious or philosophical tradition for its usefulness. But why is it hijacking? Because what you're saying the tradition is saying and what you're using it for may not be like what the originators of that tradition or the historical figures behind that tradition actually thought they were doing. Now, and this doesn't only happen in the East, this happens in the West as well. Okay. But primarily, a lot of Western individuals' approaches to Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion, we might be inclined to turn towards it just because it's different, or just, I like that. But what that sort of fetishization, that treating the Eastern way of thinking as if there's just one Eastern way, there's multiple Eastern ways of thinking, but treating it as so characteristically other that's what makes it attractive. It's attractive because it's different, or I want to accept it simply because it's not what I'm used to, that's not doing anybody any good here. Okay. Now, what about ecocentrism and wilderness preservation? Aha. So for the biocentrist, having this more biocentric and ecocentric perspective involves setting aside large portions or partitions of land to remain completely unspoiled and untouched by human industry. And agriculture is a moral end in itself, independently of any benefit that wilderness preservation has for human individuals. Okay, so Eugene Hargrove, for example, says this: our aesthetic admiration and appreciation for natural beauty is an appreciation of the achievement of complexity from that, or of complexity from that which is entirely unplanned. Right, little misprint. It is in fact because it is unplanned and independent of human involvement that the achievement is so amazing, so wonderful, and so delightful here. Okay, Eric Katz says the management of nature results in the imposition of anthropocentric purposes on areas that exist outside of human society. So we intervene in nature to create so-called natural objects and environments based on models of humans' desires, interests, and satisfactions. But in doing so, we engage in the project of the human domination of nature, the reconstruction of the natural world in our own image to suit our purposes. Okay, so what we are actually doing when we sort of get involved in nature, when we cultivate wilderness, when we cut down the trees and we, partition land for agriculture and we divide land up into parcels of private property, and our labor becomes infused with the land that we are using, and we make it productive, and we build the kingdom of God on earth by making the land produce. We go forth and we multiply and we make the land fruitful. We are actually creating the world in our own image. So the reason why the deep ecologist thinks that this is incredibly presumptive is because the world as it was in its natural state, in this sort of unspoilt and undeveloped wilderness, that was here long before us. So, again, there's this kind of anthropocentric chauvinism or pretentiousness to think that, wilderness exists and land exists to be used by us. Once again, we've got this perspective that the land and its resources are just a repository for us to, use at our own disposal. Okay. Now, but it's also the case here that human experiences in nature have value for human beings. So nature has value independently of us. So we can't just think of nature and the things in it as an endless repository of resources for us to consume and use at our disposal. But at the same time, nature does have value for us, again, understanding that we use it for therapeutic purposes and self-realization purposes. So we realize that we ourselves cannot so be easily separated as human beings, sort of qua social beings, from nature. Okay, so this is what Duvall and Sessions, the two main individuals in favor of deep ecology from the textbook, talk about. So Duvall and Sessions say the socially programmed sense of narrow self, or the social self, dislocates us and leaves us prey to whatever fad or fashion is prevalent in our society or our social reference group. So when we talk about our social programming and we talk about who we are as socially situated selves, we get the picture that, well, as social selves, our behaviors and our expectations are just as determined socially as biology is sort of naturally. So if we isolate ourselves to society, then we are just subject to cultural norms, which are completely contingent and change from time to time. So if we talk about fashion trends and we talk about, what is trendy at a given time, or what is socially accepted or socially normative at a given time, that is so flexible just through changes in economics and geopolitical situation that if we ourselves are entirely defined and determined by our social situation, then we largely have no control over who we are. And that's an incredibly alienating place to be in. Okay, So the process of the full unfolding, sessions and devolve continue. The process of the full unfolding of the self can be summarized by the phrase, no one is saved until we are all saved, where the phrase one includes not only me, an individual human, but all humans, whales, grizzly bears, the whole rainforest, ecosystems, mountains, rivers, tiniest microbes in the soil, and so on. Okay, so if my salvation or liberation from the very limiting conditions of humanity are not only the limiting conditions of humanity, but limiting conditions which are placed upon the whole of nature, then my salvation or liberation as a human cannot be separated from the salvation or liberation of nature as a whole. Okay, so if the same kinds of systems of control present in isolating the human individual as a social reality or a social self are the same systems of oppression and exploitation which are present in the human domination of nature, then this is why the entire system needs to be scrapped. So if the very same sort of systems of control which isolate us as social beings from nature make us completely socially determined kinds of individuals where we have no freedom, if these are the same kinds of socially constructed systems which subjugate nature and lead to human domination of nature, and through human domination of nature lead to ecological degradation and environmental crises and the disappearing of wilderness. So my salvation then is dependent on wilderness being liberated, the earth itself being liberated. All right. Okay, now if we were in class, this is where I would say, are there any questions? And because that's a lot to deal with here. Okay, now what about Ramachandra Guha's criticisms here in Radical American Environmentalism and Wilderness Preservation? Okay, so first of all, Guha says that the ecocentric emphasis on wilderness preservation largely ignores fundamental ecological problems which lead to environmental degradation. Now, so Guha makes it abundantly clear in his article that the problem does not at all seem to be anthropocentrism. So environmental degradation and problems related to environmental crises doesn't really seem to have anything to do with anthropocentrism per se. It largely has to do with sort of nationalism, geopolitical conflict, and overconsumption of resources by more privileged sorts of nations, right? So it's largely because of geopolitical conflict, economic crises, other humanitarian and social crises, and overconsumption by more developed nations, which is largely the cause of ecological crises, environmental degradation and the like. So he says, what does anthropocentrism have to do with it? It's not that we're human-centered per se. So if it's human-centeredness which is leading to ecological degradation, is it anthropocentrism which is largely yielding mass starvation and other humanitarian crises? No, that would be odd. So if anthropocentrism is at the root of ecological degradation, but ecological degradation and other humanitarian kinds of crises cannot so neatly be separated from each other, how is anthropocentrism at the heart of humanitarian crises? So how is it that being human-centered in our way of thinking, in our way of implementing policy, in our way of constructing social institutions, how is humanity being at the center of these kinds of things damaging to humanity? No, it's not anthropocentrism, which is the root of the problem here. It's ethnocentrism, which is at the root of the problem here. So what the deep ecologist fails to recognize is that a lot of ecological and environmental problems and crises cannot so neatly be separated from social reality. And even this sharp distinction between social reality and natural reality. This is not an easy distinction. Social reality arises out of natural reality, and natural reality is conditioned by social reality, and social reality is conditioned by natural reality. So here's the irony. While attempting to do away with dualistic forms of thinking, the deep ecologist sets up their own dualism. It's just dualism of a different kind of flavor here, where the social is dissolved into the natural, but by dissolving the social into the natural, or conflating the social with the natural, we miss out on the sort of symbiosis that exists between two distinct and yet complementary sort of realms here. Okay, so for example, in the United States, wilderness preservation and an extensive national park service are only possible because the U.S. does not need to use the resources, in Yellowstone or on the land. So the U.S. became economically prosperous and independent from years of overconsumption, imperialism, and colonialization. Okay, so the model of wilderness preservation that we have in the United States is only a model that can actually pragmatically function because in the United States we are privileged and we have the luxury of not having to drill for oil in Yellowstone. We get our oil from overseas. We don't need to mine for diamonds in Colorado. We use conflict diamond from Africa, right? So it's because of colonialization and imperialism that we are in a position geopolitically and socioeconomically where we don't have to use the only resources that we have available in our own sort of geopolitical sub-region of this planet. It's because we get our resources from elsewhere. Now, so if American environmentalism is sort of seen as the model that other countries are supposed to implement, those other countries can only implement this kind of model of environmentalism and wilderness preservation and protection if they get economically and geopolitically prosperous by engaging in the same kinds of imperialistic and colonializing behaviors that we have engaged in for so many years. And we're still engaging in this kind of way. All right. And secondly, Western emphasis on wilderness preservation ignores the social realities, right? The social realities of developing nations, and treats wilderness preservation as a one-size-fits-all kind of program here. So Guha puts it this way. He says, because India is a long-settled and densely populated country in which agrarian populations have a finely balanced relationship with nature, the setting aside of wilderness areas has resulted in a direct transfer of resources from poor to the rich. Thus, Project Tiger, a network of parks hailed by the international conservation community as an outstanding success, sharply posits the interests of the tiger against those of the poor peasants living in and around the reserve. So the designation of tiger reserves was made possible only by the physical displacement of existing villages and inhabitants. Their management requires the continuing exclusion of peasants and livestock. Okay, so all things considered in the United States, we didn't need to remove poor people whose very survival was contingent on using the resources in Yellowstone. We largely did not have to push entire swaths of poor individuals out of Yellowstone in order to designate Yellowstone, as a national park in this respect. We didn't have to do that. Okay, this is not the case in less developed nations that economically are not as well off as places like the United States. So taking a model of environmental protection and wilderness preservation, the likes that we see in the United States, and applying it in economically and socially less developed situations has incredibly disastrous humanitarian implications here. So what this kind of ethnocentrism, or I'm sorry, not ethnocentrism, but ecocentrism has, it results in a sort of what's called ecofascism, where trees matter more than humans, or land matters more than humans. But if you're in a position where you can say that land matters more than humans, like in the United States, wilderness preservation, that's not largely going to affect a lot of the citizens of the United States. So this is just another form of Western imperialism here. Not only is it a form of Western imperialism, a lot of times it just results in blatant anti-humanism, right? Because it's not the rich, white, privileged individuals whose well-being is going to be affected by wilderness preservation. It's poor individuals in less developed nations. It's persons of color, right, that are going to be disastrously impacted by these kinds of things, okay? And Guha continues, he says, in no case have the needs of the local population been taken into account, and as in many parts of Africa, the designated wildlands are managed primarily for the benefit of the rich tourists. Until very recently, wildlands preservation has been identified with environmentalism by the state and the conservation elite. In consequence, environmental problems that impinge far more directly on the lives of the poor, things like fuel and fodder and water shortages, soil erosion, and air and water pollution, have not been adequately addressed here. Okay, and then the last point I'll make here, and then I'll wrap this up because I don't want this video to get too long, is that the adoption of Eastern religions and philosophies largely over-exaggerates the biotic nature of those traditions, and it also romanticizes and fetishes those traditions as being essentially other than Western ways of thinking, as I've already indicated here. Okay, now, so to the extent that this sort of system, if you will, or way of characterizing wilderness preservation and this type of Western approach to environmentalism is in reality just another form of Western imperialism. Why? Because wilderness preservation itself has become a capitalist and economic commodity, regardless of whether or not deep ecologists are willing to admit that. So to the extent that wilderness preservation is primarily a mode of using nature for therapeutic purposes and using nature as, going out into wilderness as a form of self-realization, using nature therapeutically and using wilderness as a way of engaging with the self, using nature in a way, or wilderness in a way to engage in a form of self-discovery, that already presupposes that one is economically and socially and politically stable enough that they actually have the luxury to be concerned with self-realization and the therapeutic aspect of nature. So what we want in the West is this, and this is Guha's entire point. Socially, we want to have our cake and eat it too. So socially, we want to continue being economically and geopolitically prosperous, but we still want to have our wild havens that we can engage in for therapeutic purposes. But Guha's entire point is, to the extent that we ought to be more concerned with the lives of the less well-off, and we need to do something about these humanitarian crises in which we find ourselves in lesser developed nations, we can't have our cake and eat it too here. So to the extent that we in the West are privileged enough to look at nature and wilderness as a form of therapy and as a mode of self-realization, that already indicates how privileged we are. But even using nature as therapy and even using wilderness as therapy has itself been commodified economically and geopolitically. It's not it's not poor people that are going to safari in Africa. It's not poor people that have concern with tiger sanctuaries and habitats in India and other places in the world. It's the rich well-off who have a concern with this. So in as much as we want to talk about using nature for self-discovery, self-realization, and therapy, therapy is tourism. Self-realization is tourism. It is a commodity. It is a trend. So to the extent that deep ecologists are concerned with doing away with social trend, deep ecology itself is a social trend. Going green is productive and sort of applauded only to the extent that it is trendy, only to the extent that it is in, only to the extent that it is commodified in a capitalist society. I mean, we know that at this point. And to enforce these kinds of programs of modification in lesser developed nations, those lesser developed nations are not economically, geopolitically, and socially as stable as we are. This is just another form of Western imperialism, which has disastrous humanitarian effects. Okay, all right, so I know that was a lot here. And unfortunately, since we're not in class, I can't take questions. So if you have any questions on this material, I know it's a lot of heady material, please do not hesitate to email me. Okay, I will see you all next week.